Okay, hi everyone. This is super weird. I don't know how Kat does this every week, but hello. I'm Ashley. I'm a TA for this course. I'm going to be doing a lecture on gender. Just quick note introduction. I'm in the first year of my PhD program here at UCI. I study memes and culture and social networks. So my past research has been on Facebook pages for memes. So UC Berkeley Memes for EduTeens case study. Um, if you have any questions about that, or just want to talk about the research, feel free to come to my office hours, even if you're not a student, or shoot me an email. Um, okay, so I'm gonna get started in here. Let me pull it up. I haven't been out of the house in a very long time, so okay, here we go. So I did give this lecture in class last quarter, for that social one group. I have added a couple slides of basically more data because um, we potentially have the time for that. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. But I really wanted to include, I have links for a lot of these things, so you could feel free in your own time afterwards if you want to see more about something. You could follow the links. I've tried to put in some data from actual research in sociology so that you could see more of that. But there's a lot, in the field of gender and sociology that I just can't feasibly get to. So we'll get to what we can. So first of all, I just wanted to make this note on preferred gender pronouns. Um, in my undergrad university, this was basically the norm, that when you meet someone for the first time, or the first day of class, you introduce yourself with your name and your preferred gender pronouns. I think this is generally good practice. It's good to provide a space for someone who feels like their perceived um, gender pronouns aren't the ones that they actually prefer. So it's good practice. So my preferred gender pronouns are she, her. Um, it's just good to know. It makes other people feel more comfortable about their own if you provide a space to be sharing yours. So I just wanted to make a note on that. I do usually make my students do that on the first day of discussion sections. Okay. Okay, and then the idea that gender and sex are not synonymous. So, you have your biological sex, which, is what, you guys know, sex organs, hormones, chromosomes. You do have intersex people, so it's still not really a strict binary. Um, and then we have gender over here. So, gender identity, which is more of what you perceive yourself as. What do you think of yourself? And your gender expression. So, how do you demonstrate or present yourself to others? How do you dress? What are your mannerisms? How do you, talk to each other? These are all forms of gender expression that are really a way for you to communicate to others. Um, of course, you could be doing the opposite of what your gender identity is, turn it on its head, but basically these two terms are really important when you're looking at gender and talking about perceived gender versus what people actually assign to you. Okay, so this is like totally covering it. Okay. Okay, so gender roles are basically these norms of how men and women are expected to look or behave in society. So you have these kind of ideas of masculinity as strength, aggression, and dominance, and femininity as passive, nurturing, subordinate. Um, so you already have this kind of dichotomy here of what we expect men and women to generally be like. Um, then you have this idea of socialization and conditioning gender roles. This kind of like um, could be a form of constructivism. So we construct, these ideas of how men and women should behave, and then we socialize and condition people into those roles. So from birth, children are learning um, what their expectations are. So based on their sex at birth, people will start to treat them in a way and give them certain expectations that have them learn what their gender role is and how they should act and who they should be. Um, and then so when people are, you know, doing these things that are, um, somewhat performative and performing within a gender role assigned to them, they are said to be doing gender. It's not like sex where it's like, there's this like innate, in some way, like innate biological, your chromosomes, your genitalia. These things are more concrete than what we're talking about with gender. So it's more of a performative act, which we'll get to. This was in the reading, but I put this old ad here that's basically, to show you guys that, like, yes, these gender expectations can change over time. Um, and that's why we know they're constructed. Um, so what I tend to tell my students is, like, when you're asking of like, is something socially constructed, um, versus being like innate and like it's naturally like that, is that you'll see something change over time. And if you see this change and like what something was considered normal in one time versus another time, and that changes, then you're probably looking at something that's socially constructed, because those expectations will change over time. So here we see an advertisement of basically like skinny girls are not what men want. You need to gain some weight. And of course, now we see this is like kind of the opposite. People want to be as small as possible. So it's really showing that these expectations for gender don't come from a place of like what's natural. It's more of like what society has deemed as appropriate. Okay. Okay. So I put here too, this common thing going on the internet, talking about what is an unnecessarily gendered item, because we have this, pens for women, sprinkles that are for boys versus girls, sleep pretty in pink versus like skull screws, earplugs, man-sized tissues. You have all of these um, items that become gendered in a way that that tries to really create this separation between what is a man and what is a woman, which are unnecessary. I forgot that men and women don't have the same kind of teeth. Obviously men and women don't need different toothbrush if we have the same teeth. So this is like some sort of dialogue going on the internet. Lots of memes about this. So, okay. Then I included something that I thought was really interesting. I have the link on, I believe, the next slide, which I will pull up for you guys in a second. But there was this study that went through almost 2,000 screenplay scripts, starting from about like 1929 to 2015. Of course, most of them are from 1990 and onward, because of availability. But it's showing what words come after the word he or she in screen direction, to kind of see what's the difference in like these gendered words. So you get she snuggles, she giggles, she squeals, she sobs, she weeps, she blushes, versus he straps, he gallops, he shot, he howls, he kills, he vaults. These words have a very different connotation, action that is being done, that really give more initiative and kind of strength to whoever this male character is in the screenplay. They have a lot of really great interactive graphics. So this is one of them. I have it here. I left the link at the bottom of that slide so you guys can like kind of explore at will if you're interested. They write about, what is the logic behind this study, the methodology. But here's that table I was showing you. And so what's really interesting here is that if you hover over any of the underlined words, it'll show you actual excerpts from scripts that they were looking. So you like, she snuggles into him, she snuggles in up to him, she snuggles up to him, she snuggles close to him, she snuggles into his arms. These are all relating the female character back to the male character. If you look at these, she giggles, his hands embrace her body. She giggles as he picks her up and carries her off. And you can go through all of them. You get to a more even place where these words are a lot more neutral. And then you get to the male words. So you have like, if you look at any of these, they're not really relating him back to some female that this action is related to. These are much more independent. So, you know, by virtue, this male character is given much more like independence of strength as an individual, whereas a female character appears more to be serving the male character in terms of action. So there's a lot more things you can look at, you know, who's writing for who and what words are most commonly used. It's all interactive. So feel free to like look at that. The link is at the bottom of this slide, which will be in your slides provided to you. Okay, so we just got through talking about wealth and income. I know, you know, a big portion of this, like the dominant discussions on like discrimination between men and women is pay. Men making like 80% of what a man would make. Well, there's also the discussion that a lot of this difference can be accounted for by occupation. So, you know, men being in certain jobs, women being in other jobs. So this is where I get to, you know, something that kind of brings us back to the idea that, yes, there is a difference in men and women's pay. If it's based on occupation, then what does that mean? So if we can account for these differences in pay via occupation, let's look at who's in which occupations. So there are multiple pieces of research that really show comparative over time, looking at which occupations were male dominated and which ones were female dominated, and then looking at their pay. So this is one where you're looking at the proportion of men versus women in a job controlling for education and skill. And it shows that, you know, instead of just devaluing, so saying like a woman does this, is in this position in a male dominated field and we devalue her work, it's also the idea of queuing. So, you know, setting people up to go into these occupations that are female dominated. And saying like, you know, that's the job for you. So you have that idea. So even if you say like, okay, like, you know, there is obviously some free will here. There's this underlying bias of like, what work I believe is right for me. Why does the slide never change? Okay, so you also have this idea, which I've also linked to, that as women take over a male-dominated field, the pay drops. Kind of like an answer to the solution of, you know, you're saying, well, male-dominated field makes more money. Why don't women just take that occupation instead then? So they find that, you know, even if there was a male-dominated field, as women move into it and the ratio kind of flips and it becomes more female, the pay and the prestige of the job will go down, and vice versa. If men go into a job that was female dominated, once it's male dominated, the prestige and pay will go up. So they have some data on this. They found that, you know, they looked at up here, working in parks or leading camps became female, hourly wages declined. They have the same for ticket agents, and then they go through, you know, designers, housekeepers, biologists, and then the reverse with computer programming, which used to be seen as a menial role by women because you're just, you know, coding, sitting down on your computer. But once the male programmers took the field, it became much more prestigious. They do have this idea of, you look at the 30 highest paying jobs, right? And the lowest 30 paying jobs. The highest 30, 26 of them are male dominated. Of the lowest 30, 23 are female dominated. I did include the table for that. So I went into that. If you go into that link on the previous slide, you'll find a link to the research, which I've also put here, where they actually, no, they put the some of the occupations, and they show what's kind of the distribution of who's in this job by gender, and then what the median income is, and vice versa. One thing to note here is that these are all, at least like, attendance and working in foods concession, service workers, cashiers. These are all what a woman named Arlie Hochschild would deem as emotional labor. So jobs where you really have to take into it, like you have to present yourself as happy and nice to a customer at all times. So there's also these different kind of expectations you have in these different roles. Okay. I left a link there too, so you could look more at that. Another thing to talk about is that, how does being a parent affect your prospects in getting a job? So there was a study that shows that basically if you wrote a resume that is identical, so these were fake resumes, they are done in pairs. So there's a man applicant who, has whatever accomplishments, past, etc. Then you have an identical application for a man. And that one is all the same, except for that it notes in some space that they volunteer for the PTA. So this is the Parent Teacher Association. So basically in saying you have some involvement with the PTA, that signals to an employer that you have a child. And the same thing was done for women applicants. So there's some application, and then there is a very similar application, except for they know the PTA. And they found these like very different outcomes for each end. So for women, signaling that you have a child gives you less callbacks for jobs. It also gives you an offer of less pay than if you didn't have a child. For men, it's the opposite. So if you have some notation that you have a child, you are actually more likely to get the job, and you're likely to get higher pay than a man without a child, because you're seen as someone who must provide for their family and you're very committed to the job. So here's a table I went in to add on one of the studies that showed this. I linked the actual paper at the bottom of this if you wanted to read the paper. I know a lot of you guys put in your, at least my students put in their, like, what subfields are you interested in? A lot of people said gender is one of them, which is why I'm showing you so much data. So I put boxes around really what are the things that are most talked about in later literatures, or what were things that people really try to pull out of this, which was really people looking at competence, perceived competence, and perceived commitment to the job. Of course, the stars represent how statistically significant these are. So of course you'd prefer to have the asterisks. What's really I'm looking at here is the difference between mothers and fathers. So in terms of commitment, both of these numbers are statistically significant. So we see that the commitment perceived attributed to a father applying for a job is significantly higher than the commitment perceived from a mother. So for a father, this becomes a narrative of you are committed to the job because you have a family you need to support. And this is really important. And I know you're going to do the job. You're always going to be here to do the work. For women, that commitment is lower because there's this narrative of your kids are going to come first for you. What if you have another child and you need maternity leave, etc. We also have perceived competence. Of course, for mothers, this one is significant. None of these are. But if you're just looking at raw numbers, whether they're significant or not, just based on the study sample, Um, perceived competence of mothers is like significantly lower than any of these. Um, it's interesting that the perceived competence of a non-mother is very high, although they're they have these different ranges in error and they're not statistically significant. So it's really hard to say anything about those. Um, and then down here, we have proportion recommended for higher. And another, again, interesting that this for non-mothers is higher than for fathers, although this one and this one are not as statistically significant. So we're really looking at these two. Fathers, there's an increase in your proportion recommended for higher. Female, there's a significant decrease. So you're again seeing this opposite effect of being a father versus being a mother. Your gender and having a child, what kind of role does that play in your occupational prospects? And then, of course, that plays into pay. Another thing that's relatively new, which is getting a lot of traction online, gender reveal parties. So I try to put like some like of the ones that I at least think are like ridiculous. Touchdowns or tutus, a cupcake or a stud muffin, rifles or ruffles. But I also wanted to put this. So this is this woman is the one that actually started this trend. She was a blogger and she did a gender reveal party for her daughter. And she writes about how and also does interviews about how she actually really regrets doing this and making this a trend. That her daughter, who she did this gender reveal party, wears suits, so is breaking these gendered norms. So she likes to draw attention to this idea that people are making these attributing these very strong gendered expectations of their children before they're even born. There's no other characteristic for you to look at, like what they look like and what color their hair is, what color their eyes are. They're just attributing gender identity to an unborn child, and how can that negatively affect a child, especially if they don't really fit within these binaries. Okay, so here's the reading you guys had to do. Doing gender. I don't even know where to put myself on this slide. So doing gender means creating differences between girls and boys and women and men, which are not natural, essential, or biological. They've been constructed to reinforce the idea of the essentialness of gender. So this is where I'm really drawing on the idea that gender is a performance. You're enacting some sort of role. And these roles are assigned to you based on your sex. I've also have, so like this is part of their theory, role theory, that social construction of gender categories and how gender roles are learned and enacted is partially this idea of these roles that we have gendered already. So I put the example of a doctor versus a nurse. Doctors, people assume are male, nurses are assumed to be female, which is why a male nurse will say I'm a male nurse instead of just I am a nurse. And then why, for example, I know someone who's a doctor, and when she goes into an office to work with a patient, they'll tell her, I don't want to talk to the nurse, I want to talk to the doctor, when she is the doctor. And I do want to know, I had a student last quarter who came up to me after class and was talking about, the idea of gendered words in other languages. So she was saying, yeah, I'm an engineering student, but there is only a masculine word for engineer in my language. So when I talk to my family and tell them I'm an engineer, I am essentially saying I'm a male engineer. There's no word for me. So, reinforcing the idea that there's these even just in our vocabulary, we've kind of assigned these expectations for roles. Okay. And then, so, in talking about doing gender, there's also this conversation of what does it mean to overdo gender? Where is that line? Um, so I included this study because I think, students usually really think it's interesting. So it's the test of the masculine overcompensation thesis. You see this a lot in jokes online of people being like, oh, like, what are you compensating for? Why does that guy have such a big pickup truck? So this is like a more, obviously formal study where they're seeing like, is this overcompensation like real? And, when do we see it? So it's this idea that men react to masculinity threats with extreme demonstrations of masculinity. They're kind of like going over the top. So Rob Willer, who I believe is at Stanford, did this study. And so he would give a bunch of participants a survey that would tell them that they were masculine or feminine, or that, so they tell them, do this survey, and we will calculate your results and we'll let you know where you are on this spectrum of masculine to feminine. Of course, they didn't actually score these to make sure it was like randomized. So they had everyone take the survey, and then they put in a bunch of envelopes, some random score that they said, this is your score, and then you could see it here, and they'd put your X on here. So, men are trying to hit this area. But they would just put these in envelopes, shuffle them up, and then give them to people randomly. And so some men were assigned to be in the average female range, and some females were assigned into the average male range, or, anywhere on the spectrum. And they find these really interesting outcomes. So, in study one, so these are all within one paper, and they did all these different studies within it. They were given back their random feedback. They were either masculine or feminine. Women who were told they were masculine didn't really react in any way in terms of, how are they changing their attitude. Men who were given a feminine category were expressed afterwards more support for war, homophobic attitudes, and interest in purchasing an SUV. Just things that were in the survey. So, afterwards, they do another survey that gets their attitudes again. Study 2 showed that these same men that were threatened expressed greater support for dominance hierarchies. Those that said that social changes threatened the status of men showed more support for homophobic and pro-dominance attitudes, support for war, and belief in male superiority. And study 4, men with higher testosterone showed stronger reactions. So you're really seeing how these ideas of men being masculine, women being feminine, has this sort of, control over what you think and what you believe based on what you are perceived to be expected to believe. Someone asked last quarter, why did the women not really react, whereas the men did? And part of that kind of discussion is that, in our society where we have feminine and masculine, we see masculine as like this, they have the power, they're in these more dominant positions, and it is, like, people talk about masculinity more as like something desirable. Femininity is not as desirable. There's no power in being feminine, at least in that sense. And so a woman being told that they are not feminine, they are masculine, doesn't really affect them. A man being told he's feminine instead of masculine really threatens his sense of being and his, in essence, like the power, because of the two, masculine is what you want. That's what society values. So it's much worse to have that threatened. And then another note, I put these up in the lecture, um, the overcompensation thesis, and this to kind of show you that, when we're talking about gender and gender issues, it's not just about women. Um, so, you have men having to fit into these ideas of masculinity, and when that's threatened, how they react, because it's so precious. Um, and then you also have, going with that, this idea that by far most suicides are committed by men. A lot of people cite these as, like, economic stress of, like, having to provide and not being able to ask for help. Um, and that goes along with, like, who's referred to therapy. Much more women are referred to therapy than men, yet significantly less women are the ones committing suicide. Um, so, allowing for men to be vulnerable and not having this really constraining idea of masculinity that's saying you need to do this. If you don't do that, you're showing weakness and that's bad. Um, to trying to, like, widen the scope of, like, what you can do. Um, so that's where we kind of end this, is like gender equality is a human fight, not a female fight. Um, if you have any questions about the lecture, feel free to email me. My email should be in the syllabus. If not, you can message me on Canvas or come to my office hours or anything like that. But I hope this is somewhat interesting. I know a lot of you are really interested in gender, so I wanted to show you guys studies that you feel like kind of show you more of the field and what research is possible, what's being done. And hopefully that kind of shows you a little bit more of the field. But yeah, anyways, I hope you're all staying safe and staying sane. Yeah.